is right. And of course, if we are involved, and through us, the US is involved in launching direct missile strikes into Russia itself, what we recognize as Russia, what America recognizes as Russia, well, as far as I'm concerned, that is an act of war. And what I think about this perhaps doesn't matter. The point is that Putin is now saying it's an act of war. And, well, we can see the consequences of that.
You know, and as we're going to see here in a minute, there's a couple of reasons why a lot of people don't think that Putin actually means what he said. I actually was in a meeting earlier this day with a number of folks who generally agree that the war should not be fought, that we should wrap it down, but they also don't believe that Putin means what he says. And I won't jump the gun here because we're going to hear from some people who say that in just a second. But there are 5 former ministers of defense secretaries, and Boris Johnson that came out actually and to me inexplicably. And this is another one of the reasons why I wanted you to help us parse the words here, et cetera, because as a military person, all those things you just mentioned that were just published in the Times are certainly well known to all of these folks here. And they know intimately just how much they're actually helping and how those missiles can't fly without it. And yet they still argue that we should go ahead with it. Watch this.
Well, let's speak now to Mark Urban, diplomatic analyst and columnist at the Sunday Times, who suggests we could be heading for the end game of the conflict. Well, how significant do you think this intervention is by these 5 former defence secretaries and indeed Boris Johnson?
Well, let's speak plainly. They are 5 former Conservative defence secretaries and a former Conservative Prime Minister. So I think there's a good bit of politics in this. It's interesting to see Boris Johnson saying there's no excuse for a delay, because they should understand that there are some critical issues. Now, you've hinted at it. There are some technical issues, which is that the missile was jointly developed with the French, so they've got to be on side. But also, it needs navigational data that is provided by the Americans. So that's quite a big technical problem. You can't just decide, oh, enough of this, they're dithering too much. We'll just tell the Ukrainians they can get on with it and fire it. You do, in order for the thing to work properly, and as you've suggested, to be able to find its way, for example, around air defences, it doesn't go straight to the target. It takes a route that's designed to bypass the most likely places where it can get shot down.
So even he talks about the same thing you just mentioned and goes into a little bit more depth of, these are really sophisticated missiles that have to terrain track to get to where they're going, and it can only be done by us. So the question that I have is, why would these defense secretaries who understand all that, why do they think that they can literally strike on Russian territory and there not be a reaction?
Well, because they're all members of the British political class. And if the one thing the British political class, Labour, Conservative, and outside those 2 parties, Liberals as well, for example, are united about is that they want to fight the Russians or strike at the Russians in Ukraine. And it's important to remember these are 5, ultimately they're politicians. One of them, Ben Wallace, is a former soldier, and one would like to believe that he knows better, but than to want to get us involved in this sort of thing. But they are political figures, and they are speaking for the rest of the political class. And where I disagree with Mark Urban, by the way, who I'm very familiar with. I mean, he's an interesting and in some ways insightful writer. Where I disagree is I don't think this was playing politics, Conservatives versus Labour, them trying to be, embarrass Keir Starmer by saying, he's being soft, he should go it alone. I think the purpose of this is actually it's intended to help Keir Starmer by showing to the Americans and to the other European allies how united the British are on this one, and to try to sort of get that sort of message across that this isn't just the policy of the existing Labour government. It is a policy that all of Britain is united behind, or at least all of political Britain is united behind.
Well, and if I could reinforce that point and drive it home, here is the current Foreign Secretary Lemmy saying very nearly the same thing.
They have asked for further missiles. We have provided them. We are in discussion with them about ensuring that they get through the winter in the strongest of position. As for Putin,
but they're not going to get through the winter if they're being rained down.
Trevor, Putin said
Russian missiles.
Putin said
from Iran,
don't send
raining down on them.
Putin said
Russian bases.
Putin said don't send tanks. We sent them. Putin said don't send any missiles. We sent them. Putin threatens every few months to use nuclear weapons. It's totally unacceptable. We won't be bullied by Putin's shameless grandstanding. What he should now do is cease his aggression and leave Ukraine. That's what he should do.
Okay, well, that's fine. That's what we would like him to do, but that's not going to happen. So now we're starting to get to the part that concerns me a little bit, that they may actually believe this. And he just literally just validated everything you just said about it being the political class, not just one party over the other. But I think that he actually believes that Putin is just bluffing because he didn't do anything on the tanks and the jets and all this other stuff, that he's not going to do it now. How do you see that?
Well, I don't agree. And I think the point to make about this is that there's an enormous amount of historical reconstruction. I don't ever recall Putin coming out and saying that they should, the West shouldn't supply tanks to Ukraine, for example, or artillery shells or all of that. These were red lines we in the West put on ourselves. We said we wouldn't do these things. And then, of course, we went and did them, and it's prolonged the war, and it's made the situation worse, and it's ultimately made many people in Ukraine die. And Ukraine is now in that appalling situation, which David Lammy is admitting it's in, where it might not get through the winter. Sending the missiles actually does cross a Russian red line. Putin has never spoken in the past about we and them being in a state of war. This is completely new language from him. And it's not going to help Ukraine. It's not going to change the military situation in Ukraine. Virtually every single military analyst I've seen, including, I believe, yourself, by the way, Daniel, have said this. I mean, we can't conduct a missile offensive against Russia that's going to change the balance of the war. We are running enormous risks for no particular discernible military gains with very, very few missiles, and engaging in kind of rhetorical poses, which is in effect what David Lammy does, talking about Putin as if he was a British politician and trying to score points off him, because this is what we do a lot, by the way, in Britain. We are very much into this sort of game. It's silly.
Well, and to again underscore one of the point you had, the New York Times actually just recently ran a piece where our Secretary of Defense, Austin, said, hey, wait a minute, this will not turn the tide of the war. This is not just an analyst. This is not just a guy on a YouTube show like I am. This is the U.S. Secretary of Defense saying, in part because there are not enough ATACMS or British and French missiles. And then he goes on to say that American officials, or the article goes on to say that American officials are concerned they could not supply enough of these munitions to seriously damage a range of Russian targets. So that you see there, we're even saying, hey, cool the jets on talking about this stuff because we don't have the capacity to do this. And by the way, I had a show on earlier this afternoon where we went into all the details of why, just to your point again, militarily,